Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nita Farahani, the director of the Duke Initiative for Science and Society, and together with our co-hosts, we are delighted to welcome you to our latest coronavirus conversation about FDA's emergency use authorization, public trust, and vaccines. And after the event, I invite you to visit the Science and Society website, scienceandsociety.duke.edu, to learn about our upcoming coronavirus conversations. Our next conversation will be on October 16th on COVID-19 and prisons. And we also invite you to learn more about our master's degree programs and other educational programs where our students and faculty go in depth on the very science, technology, and ethics issues that we've been discussing in this coronavirus conversation series. Now, without any further ado, please allow me to introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Robert Califf, who's the Donald F. Fortin Physician, Professor of Cardiology and Professor of Medicine in the Division of Cardiology at Duke Medical School. He was the Commissioner of the FDA from 2016 to 2017, and before that, Deputy Commissioner for the Medical Products and Tobacco. He's a member of the National Academy of Medicine and also a nationally and internationally recognized expert in cardiovascular medicine, health outcomes, research, healthcare quality, and clinical research. He's currently the head of clinical policy and strategy at Verily and at Google Health. Dr. Eric Topol is the founder and director of the Scripps Research Translational Institute and executive vice president of the Scripps Research Institute. A cardiologist, scientist, and author, Dr. Topol is currently working on 2 major grants from NIH on precision medicine and how to promote innovation in medicine and the educational future of medical researchers. Dr. Topol is also a prolific researcher, a member of the National Academy of Medicine, and an active participant in current discussions around public health. And if you aren't already following him on Twitter, I highly recommend that you do so, particularly to follow on these issues. And our moderator today is Professor Artie Rye, the Elvin R. Laddie Professor of Law at Duke Law School, the faculty director of the Duke Center for Innovation Policy. She's also an internationally recognized expert in intellectual property law, innovation policy, administrative law, and health law. Her research focuses on intellectual property and innovation in biopharmaceuticals, and she's been really closely following the effect of FDA's emergency use authorization process on public trust in COVID-19 and vaccine innovation. For me personally, as somebody who is a research participant in the Moderna trial, I'm particularly interested to see what our panelists have to say. And with that, I'll yield the floor to Professor Rye to begin the conversation.
Thanks, Nita. And we'll go on a first name basis. I think that will be probably the best way to go since we know each other and hopefully it'll create a sense of community among the hundreds of folks who are watching. So in many respects, the topic needs no introduction. It's front page news. And in point of fact, I was just noting to our panelists that I checked the Washington Post website right before we started the panel to make sure that nothing new had happened in the last 20 minutes or so. But just to level set a bit, I will remind everyone, Nita already mentioned the Moderna trial. So there are a number of vaccine candidates, as many of us probably know, that are in phase 3 trials, and perhaps most prominently Pfizer and Moderna. The question of when they will be approved or secure an emergency use authorization has been discussed, I think, not necessarily on the front page for several months, but at least has been discussed in the popular press for several months. And there have been concerns ever since the campaigns started heating up over the summer that there might be political influence of various sorts perhaps brought to bear. That said, there was a sense that the data, that even with an emergency use authorization, would probably not be read out until perhaps close to the end of the year. Then on September 22nd, the FDA sent to the White House its enhanced guidance for a COVID-19 vaccine. And this enhanced guidance was seen by some as perhaps an attempt to reassure everyone that political considerations would not be brought to bear. The next day, the Washington Post and several other news outlets started reporting that there were individuals in the White House who had demanded a detailed justification for the enhanced EUA guidance. And then just 2 days ago, the New York Times reported that the guidance had been rejected by the White House. But the news never stops. And just yesterday, FDA decided unilaterally to publish the guidance as part of briefing materials it provided to its vaccine and related biological products advisory committee, which is to meet on October 22nd. And it now looks like, as of yesterday, the White House has approved the enhanced EUA guidance. So perhaps we'll see more cards coming off the deck, but as of now, it looks like the enhanced EU guidance has been approved. And one of its notable requirements is that it requires volunteers to be followed for a median of at least 2 months following the final dose, because the FDA wants to ensure that the safety is fairly well considered. The safety issues are well considered. So that timeline might make it highly unlikely to have an EUA before the election. And so that's where we stand. And with that, I want to turn to you, Rob, and step back a little bit and ask you a little bit about what, in your view, are the costs and benefits of the EUA mechanism, and whether it's suited or not suited in this case for vaccines.
Sure, it's great to be with you and great to join up with Eric. We had a few years where we used to talk every day, so we don't talk very often these days, so I'll bet he's going to have some interesting and provocative things to say. But the EUA is in place because of concern that has existed for a long time that in the setting of national emergency, federal agencies need to be vested with authority to act more quickly than they would under usual circumstances. And specifically, the current guidance for EUA came out in the last month of my tenure as FDA Commissioner. And so I'm pretty familiar with it. So, the easy way to think about this is think about a nuclear catastrophe, which is one of the circumstances where the president can declare a national emergency. You wouldn't want the FDA probably doing a 5-year study to deal with a nuclear attack on the US and the health consequences of that. So the EUA is specifically written to give the civil service employees who work at the FDA the authority to extend using more judgment than they would normally use, where remember that the general motto at the FDA is, "In God we trust, everyone else must bring data." And in this case, the specific authority that's given under the EUA is the ability of the FDA to use the potential benefits and demonstrated benefits and the potential risks and demonstrated risks. That means it could cover almost anything under the sun, if you think about the term potential, and it vests a lot of judgmental authority in the FDA employees. Now, I'm sure we'll get into the issue of the chain of command and the role of the civil service versus the political appointees and elected officials. But I'll stop there so that we can have a good dialogue.
So Eric, perhaps just some preliminary thoughts on the EUA as a mechanism for vaccines generally, and then we can get into some of the details of the current situation and go from there.
Sure. Well, good to join you, and good to be with Rob on this. I think the 3 words that I think of from EUA and reviewing it is "may be effective," which aligns with what Rob just described. And so that opens it up for virtually anything, may be effective. So that's what set off, I think, the struggle. It's basically a struggle between what FDA would like to do, what the companies would like to do, and what the White House, Trump, and HHS would like to do, because it's kind of somewhere caught in the middle of all those, and they have different agendas. And so we're in a very, very strange predicament.
Well, there's nothing not strange about this. One thing I had meant to mention is, because you asked it, Artie, is I do think the EUA is pertinent here. I mean, this is a once in 100-year pandemic. And so I think it's really important that the FDA has that authority. Now, then we go on to the issue that Eric just raised, which is different. But, you know, specifically nuclear catastrophes, either attacks or accidents, tornadoes, hurricanes, you know, think about the situation that existed in New Orleans after the hurricane, or pandemics, which were very specifically thought about in the guidance. This was not a surprise. We knew it was going to happen at some point.
No, I fully agree. The issue is the November 3rd timing, to have an EUA before November 3rd. That's not what this was about. So that the struggle I'm talking about is that Trump has made many announcements. There's going to be this vaccine approval before November 3rd. And even as of last night, he was on Twitter amidst his other, you know, flurry of postings where he basically went after Steve FDA because he had done this, even though the White House had signed off on it, as Artie just had summarized. So this is unlike anything I've ever seen. I mean, you were commissioner of the FDA, Rob, but after all these years, I never saw something that would be made so politicized, so ridiculous. It's not even the EUA that's the issue. It's the idea of using it as a way to win or influence an election. That's what's so scary here.
Right.
So
the same person who wouldn't wear a mask is using the vaccine or trying to use the vaccine as a way to, you know, sway the voting. I mean, it's just incredible.
yeah, so I mean, I think we'll definitely get into the very strange politics of the November 3rd date. But there also has been a little bit of a history that some of our audience members, when they signed up, asked us about with the FDA as well, regrettably perhaps, with EUAs for convalescent plasma and hydroxychloroquine. So is that part of, let me just turn to you, Eric, since you seem to be perhaps the more skeptical of the two with respect to EUAs. Is that part of your background concern as well, or is it simply the November 3rd piece of it that is playing into it?
Well, I know. I think the November 3rd piece is the culmination of, so first in March, there was the EUA for hydroxychloroquine with no data to support it, which had to be withdrawn in June when there was no data to support it and risks that were confirmed. And then there was the EUA for convalescent plasma that was trumpeted with a, quote, very historic press conference the night before the Republican National Convention with ridiculous claims of a 35% reduction of mortality. So the whole thing was just a fiasco, and it's never actually been corrected. So anyway, those were precedents now. The FDA basically caved to the whims of the administration. That's not how I would understand EUAs to be used. There may well have been good reasons for EUAs in both those circumstances, but not because a president is exerting pressure and there's obvious subservience of the FDA to the administration. That doesn't seem right.
Well, you know, I agree with Eric. It's more fun to disagree with Eric. That makes it a lot more fun to have the discussion. But you know, the former commissioners across the political spectrum, I mean, including Scott, who was a Scott Gottlieb, who was a Trump appointee, and Peggy, who was Obama's first appointee, and me, and Mark McClellan, who dates back to the George Bush days. We wrote an op-ed about the convalescent plasma because of the concern that what really needed to be done was to get the trials done. And I would say the same for hydroxychloroquine. I mean, there was a theoretical basis and a lot of people were using it. So the key was to get the trials done, which showed it didn't work. And I think convalescent plasma, I think it's still unknown. It's notable that the recovery trial in the UK has now enrolled over 1,000 people in a convalescent plasma trial, and it hasn't been stopped. So if there was a 35% reduction in mortality with an underlying 25% mortality rate, it would be highly likely that the trial would have been over probably at 400 to 500 patients enrolled. I do want to also mention there's, you know, I thought Artie you might bring this up, but there is a new situation today with the monoclonal antibodies, which are now submitted to the FDA for EUA. And that one I'm actually, of course you have to see the data, and the FDA actually gets to look at the raw data. I've seen the tabulations, but not the raw data. But if it looks as good as the raw data, that one I would feel pretty good about going forward with.
What about you, Eric, on the antibody question? Just, I know that's a little bit off topic, but we will mention it just briefly.
Well, I've been excited about the monoclonals. They're potent neutralizing antibodies, and well before President Trump received that on Friday last week, you know, I think there was our best promise for a therapy that could get us out to the vaccine, and may even well be useful when vaccination is starting, because it is so potent. So we have high expectations. We don't have a lot of data, but we have 2 phase 2 trials that have been reported, and they both look encouraging. There you can see where an EUA would have rationale. I don't think that either trial cinched it of these phase 2. They just had supportive data for reducing viral load and some suggestion of outcomes improvement. In the Lilly trial, it was, you know, reducing hospitalization to some extent, but without a good dose response. And then in the Regeneron trial, it was just medical visits. It was not even it was softer than Lilly. But, you know, together, you know, I think it's a good case. In fact, you know, many of these things could have been well suited for an EUA. It's just the circumstances that were involved. And that, I think, is the troubling part of this.
Yeah, so Artie, I actually don't think it's off topic, because if you look at this as a continuum, you got hydroxy, which just had no basis other than theory and no credible evidence that it was beneficial. You had convalescent plasma, which had a single arm registry and a couple of randomized trials that were not positive, that, you know, may have had trends. So, and then you got this one, which we should pause a second and just comment on the triumph of, I mean, that, to me, it was the way the system was supposed to work. You had a new virus with a pandemic, and the biomedical industry went to work between academia and industry. They actually got samples of people that had been infected and developed a monoclonal antibody, one from a US person, one from a Chinese person, interestingly, in the Lilly case. And they've done very highly controlled, placebo-controlled clinical trials measuring the biomarker and the clinical outcomes. And these trials that we're talking about now, that I agree with Eric, are preliminary evidence. There are many other trials that are underway. So there's, you know, a cascade of evidence that's going to come in. Now the FDA, you know, is looking at high quality data that's limited. In a usual circumstance, you would wait and say, you know, bring in the phase 3 trials, and then we'll look at it. In this case, you got 1,000 people a day predicted to die in the US between now and January, and many more around the world. And so it's a good case for the FDA to exert its judgment. And, you know, I have complete trust that it will do that. The data came in now, not because the president was treated. It came in because the trials were finished. The phase 2 trials were finished. So it was time to report them.
So you're right. I didn't mean to say it was off topic, but one of the differences, obviously, between a therapy and a vaccine is a vaccine is given to healthy individuals. So that makes the hydroxychloroquine and plasma a little bit different as well. So in the context of vaccines, where I know both of you have thought a lot about the public's hesitancy regarding vaccines because, you know, they are given to millions and millions of people who are healthy. How is this current, shall we say, set of events in the last few weeks change or not change how you think the risk-benefit calculus should be calculated? So more specifically, is the enhanced approach that the FDA has put forward, does that seem appropriate to you, presuming it goes forward and is not overturned at some point down the line?
Well, maybe I'll start that. I think that all the companies on the vaccine, I mean, there's 5 that we know, well, 4 protocols that have been released. Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, Janssen, and AstraZeneca. We don't have the protocol of Novavax. They're all phase 3 and, pretty far along in many of these trials. The problem across the board is they all end with about 150 events approximately, not much difference. So Pfizer's at 164. But the construct of the trials, and Rob and I know this because we did large trials together, they have a variable number of interim analyses. The outlier is Pfizer with 4. And they have stopping rules. And the peculiarity of this is that, and I talked to the Pfizer vaccine team last week, which was an interesting call that they arranged because they didn't like what I was saying about their trial in writings and whatnot. But they have a very low threshold endpoint. That is, a headache or a sore throat with a positive PCR would be an endpoint of infection, which doesn't really sway me as having a big effect. I don't know about you, but so we discussed that. And the thing that troubles me the most is they do a plan for an EUA application in the weeks ahead, this month. They have interim analyses, multiple this month. So we could be seeing an EUA before the end of the month, and that goes through a process that Rob would be familiar with. But I actually think that that's very tricky because on the one hand, they're going to try to get an approval. On the other hand, they're going to try to get their trial finished with the 164 infections. And they're going to have these placebo participants who are not going to cross over an extended period of time. So, there's a very questionable ethical story here. How can you say it's good enough to start giving it in mass quantities to healthcare workers and essential workers and high-risk individuals, and you won't even give their participants that got placebo the vaccine? So this is setting up, to me at least, some very, strained issues.
So Rob, would you like to respond to that? And then
of course, we have the EUA Guidance Plus. I do want to remind everybody that a guidance actually is a guidance. It says right on the front, not binding. It's the current thinking of the FDA. It's different than a federal rule, which does have the rule of law. And so just remember that everything we're talking about is there's a lot of flexibility here, like the ultimate flexibility throughout. But, the Guidance Plus that just came out with the briefing materials for the October 22nd Advisory Committee meeting does say this requirement that you mentioned of a median of 2 months of follow-up. And I think that is going to push it out beyond the election, Eric, no matter what. Now, if you had a direct conversation with Pfizer about this, I could be mistaken, but my understanding, they also increased the sample size of the Pfizer trial, which is going to push it out by the criteria the FDA has put forward. So I think it's very reasonable for FDA to look at the data for an EUA based on the guidance that was just put out. The decision, of course, is like all FDA decisions, is dependent upon what the data show. And of course, the FDA is a regulatory agency, but it's also a public health agency, which is a very important part of the legal precedents that it operates under, because it will have to consider a variety of factors besides just the trial data itself.
So that was my follow-up, the 2 months out thing. Question to you, Eric, would that push them past November 3rd? And that's A. And then B, for both of you, in terms of considerations that one can put into the risk-benefit calculus, should the diminished public trust be a consideration or not?
Right, yeah, no, that's a vital point. We'll get to that in a second, I guess, but just to go close the loop on this issue about the EUA process, I think that's going to happen here would, by the guidance, the non-binding guidance, the companies all got this guidance weeks ago. There's nothing new here. The only thing new here is the struggle of that the commissioner and Peter Marks, who's running the vaccine group, how do they get that into some kind of document and to the public? Because it was received by the companies. So that has toughened the criteria for EUA, which is a good thing. That's the least that we get. One of the problems is it's only a 2-month median follow-up. So remember, Pfizer started their vaccine trial back in July, so the 2-month median would not be hard to achieve. But the real issue is that the companies want to fulfill the non-binding FDA new guidance document. So that would go against any potential pre-November 3rd. That would take us well into November or December, right? So that's good, but that still leaves us with, they have an EUA, it gets approved, latter November, early December, whenever, and then what do you do with the people in the trial? Pfizer says they can just keep going with the trial, and they have various ways to justify that. Perhaps the other companies do as well. So there's many layers of issues here, but we also don't know whether the trump card will be thrown. That is, we know that as of last night, and maybe it changes every minute, the president isn't happy about this. And funny that the White House signed off on this tightened guidance that was slipped into Appendix 2 into the non-binding document that the Vaccine Advisory Board and the public got to see yesterday. And we know that there's been tremendous pressure and tension between HHS, the White House, and Commissioner Hahn and all the people at FDA. So, this has been a circus act, and it's very delicate stuff here.
Yeah, Artie, I don't know if do you want to go through the doomsday scenario on that one that Eric just brought up?
So one potential doomsday scenario would be, well, actually there are 2 potential doomsday scenarios, I suppose. And one would be that, that the FDA holds the line and President Trump decides at a certain point that he no longer likes the line and threatens the head of the FDA with firing if the line is his approach is not taken. So this would be, we saw this in the context of the Saturday Night Massacre, in the context of Watergate, where ultimately you just fired people until somebody was able to did what you wanted. So that's one doomsday scenario, and let's hope we don't go there. Another one that is a little bit more peculiar and has to do with the weirdness of the way the statute for the EUA, as I understand it, is written, is that the HHS secretary has the power that he has then delegated to the FDA head, but that's the statute itself gives the power to the HHS secretary. So that's a little bit bizarre as well.
Well, but Artie, no. Let me, for better or worse, I had to spend many hours on this because of the Sarepta decision during my tenure, and the whole basis for my not intervening in the dispute between the center director and the staff at the FDA was that there actually is a literal chain of command. So the statute for all FDA decisions directs it to the secretary.
Right.
Secretary delegates to the FDA commissioner as a matter of form. And then for individual product decisions, 99.99% of the time, the FDA commissioner delegates to the center director to make the final decision. And one of the reasons for that I learned in the Sarepta case was because it does give the FDA more authority with the courts, and judges are more reticent to intervene because of the precedent of science-based decisions by people without a political overlay. And that's been frequently used to, otherwise the FDA would have to, logarithmically increase its legal staff to deal with all the challenges. And so the authority the president has is what you mentioned, which is that he can fire the secretary or the commissioner at will
Right.
and
I
reinstate
think
someone
that's
else.
the more, I don't want to get into the weeds of a legal seminar here, because that's not, you know, what we should be doing, but maybe you and Rob, you and I, Rob, can do it offline, because it's very interesting. But yes, that's the true doomsday scenario, the firing power. And so let's hope that doesn't you know, become an issue, but that's, you know, the
Well, you know, I think,
ultimate.
I think just to put in context, we already saw HHS take away the LDT authorities of FDA. So there was a precedent for them to, and that led to tremendous tension, as I understand, between the two entities.
Yeah.
HHS and FDA are not getting along very well, to put it mildly. And also, you know, we know that this whole deep state thing, a tweet, led to the caving of the convalescent plasma. So, you know, I think the issue we have with that precedent, where, you know, on one day there was a tweet from Trump to Steve Hahn about the deep state not approving things, and then later that day there was an announcement there's going to be a breakthrough conference, press conference. So the intimidation factor, you know, we don't know how that, on the one hand, as you say, he could be fired. And the other, he could be, you know, he could be subject to intimidation. We don't know how he'll respond. Maybe this time he won't be so responsive and participate in a press conference and present hyperbolic stuff. You know, we just don't know.
Right. So the politics is Rob, let me let you get that last word in on the politics, and then there are lots of questions coming in with respect to some of the science issues as well.
Well, I was actually going to go there. I was just going to say, throughout all this, the abiding confidence in the process of FDA science, I think, has been a really critical factor. I mean, and the support for FDA scientists or science in the biomedical community is really critical. So, you know, the hydroxychloroquine and convalescent plasma decisions are controversial, to say the least, but the fact is neither had a big impact on practice because they didn't really have the credence or sort of enthusiastic backing of the FDA staff, and people knew that.
So we've gotten a bunch of questions on how, let's say, an EUA is awarded either, you know, for very proper reasons or perhaps for improper reasons, but let's assume the high road, that it's awarded, say, in December, you know, after a thorough vetting, appropriate to the standard. How, and this perhaps goes to Eric's point, how is it going to affect clinical trial enrollment more generally in perhaps for the Pfizer, let's say it's Pfizer, for the Pfizer trial going forward, and perhaps for other trials?
Well, I mean, it takes time to get a product through all the hurdles that you have to get through. Even with an EUA, it still has to be manufactured and distributed, and some of them require deep freezing, which is problematic. So I'm actually not particularly worried about the trials that are currently ongoing getting completed. There are a whole other set of issues related to what should be the requirements for post-market, and what if someone develops a really great new vaccine, you know, in the next 3 or 4 months, something really looks super, or how do we know among the vaccines that are effective compared to nothing, which ones are best? I mean, these are not new things that, you know, have never happened before. It's just because of the threat of the pandemic, they're prescient and difficult.
My concern about this, Artie, is that we're going to extrapolate ultimately from 150 infections, which may be, you know, relatively mild, to give vaccines to hundreds of millions, if not billions of people. And we've never seen this type of extrapolation. You know, there's never been, that I'm aware of, a vaccine that would be given to the planet of people. So theoretically, at least. So the lot's on the line here. Now, two of the vaccine programs are dealing with a product, a messenger RNA, which has never been at scale in people. It's a message for the spike protein, and we don't know how that's going to behave in mass exposure. And, a trial of 30,000 or 60,000 in the case of J&J, it sounds really big, but it's tiny compared to what's going to happen later. We're talking about exponential, many orders of magnitude more exposure. There has to be some untoward responses. And hopefully there'll be, one in a gazillion, but it's going to happen.
Yeah, Eric,
So,
I mean, that's true, but I'm definitely not arguing with that, but you can easily envision the scenarios that are going to occur. And I will say that for full vaccine approvals for very widely used vaccines, it's not that uncommon that if it's 90 to 5, in the outcomes, or if it's 154, if it's 140 to 14, it's a slam dunk. And you're sitting out there, I don't know how old you want to admit you are, but I'm just turned 69. I'm afraid to get on an airplane. I would love to, I would take some risk to take a vaccine if it was a slam dunk. But it could also be, a 2-to-1 ratio, which would be much more marginal.
right.
Where then the worry about adverse events, would play in much more heavily. If there were just a couple, let's say, the FDA could very well say the balance is not good enough to go forward in that way.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the point here is that, these trials are trying to detect 50 to 60% efficacy. They're basically just fulfilling the FDA criteria. And the point estimate of 50 or 60 with a lower confidence interval of 30. If it hits 31, that would be on the lower band, that would make it. So, this first generation of vaccines may not be the 90% efficacy that we would love to see. And there are going to be, there's over hundreds of candidates now of vaccines in the pipeline. But, I think the issue here is more safety data. We wrote a letter to the FDA that was received yesterday that 60 of us, that we wanted 2 months for all people safety, not just a median of 2 months. Now, that's probably not going to get changed. Just getting the guidance document as it stands was a task in itself. But what I'm saying is the more confidence, because the point I think a lot of people don't get here is that the vaccine, once we get an EUA or even a formal licensure, that doesn't get us out of the wood. We're still going to be wearing masks for another year or more. And it takes a long time to get a large population level immunity. So what we're looking at here is, no magic. We're just looking at a threshold. Okay, we've got a vaccine and it works. And, we got a long ways to go. And what's interesting to think about is these vaccines are unlikely to achieve sterilization immunity, which means that we could engender more asymptomatic carriers, because people could be carrying the virus in their nasal mucosa, even though it's protecting them from getting illness. So there's a lot of things out there that are dangling that, this idea that the vaccine is a magical threshold, that's not true.
Well, yeah, go ahead, Artie. I don't want to. I want to make sure you get in your questions.
No. Please go ahead. I had one follow-up thought to the safety concern, but
yeah. So I'm 100% sure the FDA is going to require extensive post-market evaluations of special populations. The issue of what happens to people after they've been vaccinated, it probably will be more like the flu vaccine than like measles. I mean, it's probably not going to completely eradicate. It's going to, reduce the risk, and it's going to reduce the risk of serious outcomes, most likely. And so, it could be a scenario like Eric said, where you turn a lot of people into asymptomatic carriers, or it could be that they're late post-vaccination exacerbation of immune phenomena that, these things could happen. So they've really got to be carefully studied, but fortunately, the cost of post-marketing, the feasibility of doing it now on a large scale is coming down because of the widespread availability of electronic health records and digital follow-up of people.
So I'm glad you afforded me that opening. I mean, post-marketing monitoring has not been a success story in all cases for the FDA in general. I'm sure you're aware of some of the data suggesting that often companies don't comply with their requirements to submit their post-marketing data. Do you think things will be different in this case because it is vaccines and it is as important as
yeah, I mean, let's just keep in mind the amount of public scrutiny here. And I think, you know, Eric referred to the manufacturers. They, you know, they've been pretty outspoken about their commitments here, and I don't see them going back on it because they would be eaten alive by the biomedical public and others. And so, you know, if we think about all the layers here, you've got the research, which is going to have to be high quality and supervised by the FDA, and then you got all the different people watching. You got a bunch of Erics out there that are keeping an eye on things, and you can follow his Twitter. But you also got people like Tony Fauci, who, you know, I can guarantee you that regardless of what the FDA says, a lot of people are going to be looking for the Fauci nod of approval. And I don't think he's going to be able to, I mean, I don't think he would ever, knowing him, I don't think he would ever not tell the truth about it. But even if he tried to, knowing him, he couldn't. You would know what he thought. There's just no way around it. And I put Francis Collins in that same boat. I mean, very high integrity and authoritative. You got two you got the advisory committee, which is pledged to occur, and you've got the vaccine advisory committee to the CDC, which both have independent people. They're going to be outspoken and they're going to be watching.
Well, yeah, but just to point out, I agree with the high respect and regard for both Francis Collins and Tony Fauci, but they were adamant against the EUA for convalescent plasma, and it went ahead anyway. And they even published a statement post-approval that it shouldn't have happened and that we don't know about convalescent plasma. So there can be divergence. I mean, the FDA went one way, and two notable authorities who are high in public trust went the other way. So let's hope we don't go there. I actually think that this recent volley between FDA and the White House and the companies now standing behind the FDA, which is nice to see. Hopefully we're going to get past that. But you know, I still don't think that it's all settled, because post-market surveillance, Artie, without a placebo control anchoring, is very difficult to evaluate. It's basically going to tell us about safety, right, but it's not going to tell us about durability. So the biggest question that's going to remain in the next phase is, how long does this vaccine offer protection? Does it give us 6 months, a year? You know, when do people have to get a booster shot after their first 2 doses, or, you know, with one of the programs, you know, a single dose? But, you know, this is a big issue because, you know, just getting it through this first hurdle, there's many more to go. And so the longer the trials go with a placebo control, not with just surveillance, the better we'll be able to understand the durability. And, you know, with the background about coronaviruses and our immune response, there's a lot of concern that this might not be a long-lasting immunity.
Right. So there is a concern about, yeah, we've been focusing, I think, mostly on the post-marketing safety issues, but there is the efficacy long-term question as well.
You know, this is the reverse of the way we usually are, because Eric and I used to work together on developing new therapies, and he was always excited about, and I was always the naysayer, this probably won't work. But so let me take the opposite point of view of Eric, at least to raise. So I don't discount anything he said. I think we have to be vigilant about all the issues that he's raised, and they could come up. But there's also a scenario where the combination of the monoclonal antibody for people who do get infected and the vaccine could suppress the virus substantially, because there is at least pretty good circumstantial evidence that viral load is really important in transmission. In other words, the asymptomatic carriers that are big transmitters probably have high viral loads, and it's probably right before they become symptomatic that they really, you know, we just had evidence. I like the joke more. coronavirus cases in the White House than in Taiwan, Korea, or Japan combined now, or something like that. That was the latest thing going around. So, you know, there is a scenario where with really judicious use of therapeutics for people to get infected, as the vaccine rates go up, that we could come out better. But also agree with him, we should be wearing masks and planning to social distance at least through next summer. I wish I felt differently about it, but that's the way it is.
And relatedly, what percentage of the population do you think would have to get vaccinated in order to get some sort of, including with the therapies that are coming forward, some sort of herd immunity?
There's a lot of wiggle on that uncertainty because we don't know how effective the vaccines are.
Right, right.
If the vaccines are, you know, the 90% plus category, it's going to be, you know, maybe that's closer to the 60% level, whereas they're just scraping at 50% efficacy, then we're looking at, you know, 80+%. So, you know, we don't know. We just don't know. And if it's short durability, that makes it even more complicated because the virus is going to be circulating for some time. And to Rob's point, you know, I'm actually pretty keen, and I have been, on the monoclonal antibodies, but they can't be made at large quantities, and they're going to be very expensive. And outside of, you know, the N of 1 study that we just watched or are watching, who thinks that, you know, we shouldn't be afraid, you know, they're not going to be, people are going to get this darn thing. And even 4 of them, there's now 2 more companies that are going to have data, Glaxo and Ver, before the end of the year. So, you know, if we could sprinkle monoclonal antibodies in all the high-risk people as a preventive measure, I mean, it should work preventatively. You know, the company already offered, you know, Joe Biden to take antibodies. So,
but Eric,
you know,
Eric,
I just want to say that, you know, it's unrealistic to think that a lot of people are going to get this stuff.
well, but
Even if it works.
Lilly has 1 million doses already ready to go.
Yeah. 1 million with 330 million Americans and 7.8 billion people. 1 million is nothing. Nothing.
Oh, you said high risk.
Oh, I mean, high risk, 1 million people. I can give you 30 million like that of high risk people. 1 million is nothing. Nothing. Our population is a walking high risk population in general.
But Eric, this is funny because I'm the cup half full guy today. But this is 1 million before the thing has even been approved. I mean, that's unprecedented. And it's a huge scale up. And
what expense, Rob? How much is it going to cost for a dose?
That's a great question.
So that'll be very interesting as well.
I mean, just extrapolate what monoclonal antibody isn't expensive in the tens of thousands of dollars. Do you know of any?
Well, wait a minute. Let's talk about the cost and the charge, because, I mean, remember, you and I were involved in one of the first monoclonal antibodies ever used therapeutically with ReoPro.
Mm-hmm.
And
heard of that.
You know, the cost of scaling has gone way down. So it'll be a matter of public debate what the cost should be. And, you know, you raise the issue of low-income countries, for example. It's going to be really important that there's a distribution system that at least makes very high-risk people, gives them some access, assuming that scaling is possible. You know, it's a good issue that you've raised.
Do you think that scaling of vaccines will happen as necessary, since we brought up scaling? It seems like we have capacity, but is that at all a concern for you?
Yeah, you're bringing up an important point. We need multiple vaccines to be successful. Mm-hmm. No one company could supply the world's population. That's why the fact that there are 8 trials in phase 3 and many more to come is really important, because even though they all aspire to make lots of vaccines and make them available, we have a lot of people out there that are going to need vaccines. And your point about public trust, Artie, that don't want to miss that. It's so essential, because if something happens with the first vaccine that gets out, where there's some immunopathologic reactions, it's going to be a real damaging blow to the vaccine rollout, where we need the high proportion of people. So this is another consideration. You know, we need vaccines. They're the main part of our pandemic exit strategy, but we also want to play the odds where, you know, it minimize the chances of a major breach of trust because of a rash, a cluster of serious adverse events that somehow, you know, like we've seen with the AstraZeneca, it's still on hold, that trial in the US, a month later after this transverse myelitis was reported. Well, we sure don't want, who knows what's going on there, but we don't want a rash of transverse myelitis, which is in the continuum of multiple sclerosis, to occur if it's indeed vaccine related. Back to Rob's point, yeah, we can accept an incredibly low serious adverse reactions, but we're talking about vaccinating healthy people. So the trade-off there, the balance, is a delicate, tricky one.
Well, I mean, it brings up another aspect of the EUA that I think is really important. And I sort of raised it before, but just to be real explicit. One, the FDA has authority to say this is an EUA, let's say, for people over age 65 with 3 other comorbid illnesses because their mortality rate is so high. And remember that there are trials now involving, for example, nursing home or LTAC patients where, you know, there's been such an extraordinarily high mortality risk. So it's possible that this population that's not like totally healthy people would be a little bit closer to the sick population that you think about for therapeutics than the typical vaccine, which is given to completely healthy people. And so it may be that, depending on the data, of course, that you could have a gradual rollout focused on targeted populations where the benefit risk balance is thought to be most in favor of vaccination.
So related to that, and related also to the public trust comment, who would be, as we were rolling it out, perhaps in a more staged way of the sort that you suggest, Rob, under an AUA, who would be the most appropriate communicators of risk so that the populations in question would trust? So if they were a nursing home population, who is the most appropriate communicator of risk to that population, and so forth and so on?
Well, I mean, just to correct one thing Nita said at the beginning, I retired from Duke in September after 50 years, and I'm an adjunct professor, no longer on the faculty. So my endowed professorship that was so nice is going to someone else at this point, and I work full time at Alphabet. And let me tell you, you know, there are 4 billion people a day that use one of our products, mostly to get information or directions. And so I've been thinking a lot about this. Karen DeSalvo, who was Assistant Secretary for Health in the last administration, is leading the effort at Google to deal with this. But the bottom line is, we know that people are going to respond most to people who they have confidence in, not because they're scientists, but because they have confidence in them. And so a rural North Carolina person where we are would respond to a different person than a La Jolla person where Eric is. And so one of the tragedies that we have to avoid is letting let's say we have an effective vaccine, is letting the political divisions keep us from gathering the people that others trust to be the ambassadors for the vaccine. That's the way I see it.
And Eric, do you have, since you've sounded the theme of public trust quite a bit, in terms of specific entities or individuals who would communicate, one of the questions that we were asked even before the event began was, are doctors like yourselves the best people to communicate, and what role, and going to the point about Google, what role can social media or media play? Or
yeah, no, I think this is a formidable challenge, because we have a lot of anti-vaxxers that started well before the pandemic. We have all sorts of conspiracy theories, and we have, you know, the people still saying that this is like the flu and this is a hoax, and why would you take a vaccine if it's like the flu or the hoax? And so, you know, we have a serious problem. And, you know, ideally what we should be doing is working on this now. And social media is important. So when the TikTok video was made, I don't remember her name, about, pro-vaccine, it was enormously picked up and successful. Those are educational things now. The idea of a social contract, that is, I take the vaccine to help you, not just to help me. Just like a mask. I wear a mask to help you, not just me. We haven't had a modeling. If we actually had a president who believed in science, let's be frank, we'd have a lot more people wearing masks right now, and would have a lot more people, taking a vaccine. We have negative role model to go against the science. That doesn't help. So we need lots of things to converge. We need education. We need a government that actually supports science rather than negates it and squashes it. And we need, to get to people of all diverse backgrounds, as Rob's pointing out, to get them to buy in. And, celebrities, whether it's sports or entertainment, they have a lot of sway. If we get them behind, we've seen that, of course, wearing masks. They've done some campaigns. We need that for vaccines in a big way.
Artie, also, I mean, you mentioned it, and I was remiss in not mentioning it. A lot of people I talk to say they would talk to their doctor or their favorite nurse or their pharmacist if they go to the pharmacy once a month to pick up their pills. And so I think it's really critical that this is a call to action really for the biomedical establishment, that is medical schools, professional societies, and not just doctor type people, but all the healthcare professionals that so many others depend on. They're going to look for the nod from that person. And it's one reason I actually am pretty confident that we'll come out in the right place here, because it's not just, I trust the FDA to make a good decision, but even beyond that, with all these committees, all these people, and the public airing of the data, the only way I think it could go wrong is if there's, some kind of a rift in the biomedical community where there's just not any kind of consensus. So, but I'm pretty confident that we'll get there.
So you think ultimately, if the biomedical community can stay united in the service of science and reason, that the politics will kind of take care of itself, perhaps?
Well, Eric got me going on the convalescent plasma, which I was very upset about, because, I feel like we started a lot of the registries very early in my career, and registries are valuable and they're useful, but not for defining efficacy of interventions. But really, it turned out to be a nothing, right? Because the biomedical community didn't buy that it was going to save 35 out of 100 people. They, that was quickly figured out. And although it wasn't officially corrected, I think the world basically got the message because so many people spoke up. And I think the same would happen here, or at least I'm very hopeful it will.
So I have one last question, and this is from Nita, and I have been remiss in not asking it, but it's a small question, and hopefully can be answered quickly. Antibody-dependent enhancement with any of the vaccine candidates, are you particularly concerned about that?
Well, if you talk to the immunologists, it's out there as a possibility. It's dangling. It's not thought to be, as high as some of the vaccines where it's been seen, but it's still out there. That and serum sickness and any of the immunopathologic reactions could occur. We got to keep our eyes open for it.
Okay.
I'm worried about everything, but I think the dictum is prepare for the worst, but hope for the best. And I think Eric's given us like a long list of things to worry about. So
no, I haven't. No, I haven't.
Well, Eric,
as always, he mischaracterizes everything.
Well, on that great note, from former collaborators and perhaps to-be collaborators, I follow both Eric and Rob on Twitter, and Eric I start with, and then Rob then makes me feel better. So, no, I'm joking.
No, I mean, it's well known. I follow Eric's, his tweeting, there are like 3 or 4 people that people should follow if they want to know what's going on. He's got it down.
Well, thank you to both of you for taking time out. I know you've got lots of stuff on your plate. Really very much appreciated. And thank you to everyone listening in the audience. I tried to get as many of the questions some of you folks put into the chat as possible. And hopefully it was useful to everyone out there.